Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar and presentation of the Dunbar Fellowship from 2019. We've got our 2019 recipient of the Dunbar Fellowship, Rosemary Kennedy, joining us today to present on her experience from being the successful recipient of this scholarship. But before we kick off, I did want to do a quick acknowledgement of country. I find that after recent events in our nation, I think that's even more important than previously. So the Royal Australian Institute of Architects recognises the unceded sovereign lands and rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of the land and waters on which we meet today. This recognition generates acknowledgement and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander countries, cultures and communities, and their ways of being, knowing and doing. Caring for country practices, including architecture and place shaping, have existed on this continent since time immemorial. The Institute recognises a professional commitment to engage and act meaningfully through reciprocal partnerships and relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Together, we will support and develop the emergence of new possibilities for our shared future. And so welcome to this Dunbar Fellowship presentation. For those of you who are not yet familiar with the Dunbar Fellowship, it is a fairly recently established fellowship. So Rosie, who's presenting today, is actually our only Dunbar Fellow so far, because it then got paused after Rosie was awarded because of COVID. So we're very, very excited to have this back on the map again, because it really truly is a fantastic scholarship fellowship. It was established as a result of a generous bequest that was left to the Institute by the late Jennifer Taylor, and it is to be awarded by the Queensland Chapter of the Institute for the purpose of undertaking a program of study or research in Asia and or the islands of the South Pacific Ocean. That's excluding Australia and New Zealand. That will, in the view of the Institute, contribute to the advancement of architecture and its practices in Australia. Or it could also be to assist the Dunbar Fellow to undertake a minimum of 1-year course of study at an approved university, leading to a further academic qualification. And the output of this fellowship is precisely what Rosie is doing today, the presentation that follows, and to disseminate that learning from that travel, and also through a report, which we are working on setting up a bit more of a nicer format for that report, so that we can host that nicely on the Institute website. So that's all work in progress in the background. But for today, I'd like to introduce Rosemary Kennedy, who actually was one of my first lecturers at university as well. So really delighted to introduce Dr. Rosemary Kennedy, who has a substantive background as an architect and design integrator in education and practice, arising from a strong interest in the elements that establish good design for people. Rosie is a passionate advocate for well-designed, climatically responsible cities for a livable and just future. Her belief is that it is imperative that design skills are focused on sustainability with resilience and beauty nurtured for the long-term benefit of all. Rosie is perhaps most known to us all through her establishment of the Subtropical Cities Consultancy, which happened in 2016. Which was established to collaborate with planning, architecture and urban development organizations to complement their climate responsive approaches to city design and architecture for humid, tropical and subtropical places globally. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Rosemary Kennedy to present her Dunbar Fellowship that's titled Next Generation Apartment Buildings.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everyone. Whether you're interested in applying for the Dunbar Fellowship or the content, which I'm presenting today, of my findings. I hope you enjoy it. So this is pretty much my findings from 2018. Asian cities are quite literally the epicenter of high-density living, dealing with rapid urbanisation and accommodating people on a massive scale. They've developed rapidly into dense metropolises with vast areas of climate-controlled indoor space, enabled by the transfer of 20th century Western technologies. In 2018, I went to Southeast Asia to investigate how some outlier apartment buildings emerging there have broken the status quo and rejected the air-conditioned glass box typology that's prominent in residential towers everywhere now. I wanted to know whether these outlier buildings could lead game-changing east-west knowledge transfer in Australia. These images show two approaches to tall apartment buildings in Bangkok. The Met on the right, designed by Singaporean architects Woha, completed in 2009, is one building made up of 6 towers, 1 unit thick, separated by shafts and breezeways, linked by bridges of communal terraces and gardens. The building's vertical voids generate rising air, moving at velocities to effectively cross-ventilate apartments. Double-height balconies allow good daylight to be received into the units. Frangipani trees give human scale to the facades. The architects describe it as a domesticated megastructure. Nearby, the King Power Mahanakhon Tower, completed in 2018, designed by Bureau Old Sheeran, houses the Ritz-Carlton residences. Its eroded form is meant to generate spaces that merge the tropical outdoors with the indoors. Some spaces in that very tall tower may well do that, but a glass box is still a glass box. Contemporary high-rise apartment buildings are the most energy intensive, the most energy dependent of any high-density housing type. Yet, like the Met, new apartment building models that break the sealed glass box paradigm are emerging in Southeast Asia. While visiting the developer's Mahanakhon sales gallery, I was fortunate enough to see the model for their totally cross-ventilated windshell Narrawitas Tower, designed by Kevin Mark Lowe, with architect of record ACS Design Studio Limited. Outrageously overscaled in terms of square meterage per dwelling, but its architectural versus technical approach to climate control breaks the mould nonetheless. My study took me to these tropical and subtropical megacities. The effect on every sense is enormous in Hong Kong. The sheer scale of everything man-made is staggering. The maelstrom's unbelievable in a city in a relentless cycle of construction, demolition, and rebuilding. Hong Kong's official population is 7.5 million, though some unofficial estimates put the actual population at 11 million. Drastically reduced dwelling space is common. Nano or micro flats, slightly bigger than 2 average sedans. A hidden population live in coffin homes where it's only possible to lie or sit, and cage homes, subdivided units, half the size of a parking space, literally enclosed with steel mesh. The ancient city of Old Canton has grown into Guangzhou, a global city of wide tree-lined boulevards in just under 40 years. It's probably over 40 years by now. The pedestrianised old centre gives way to super tall buildings, a state-of-the-art mass rapid transit system, but sprawl, spaghetti freeways, flyovers, interchanges, congestion, and extremely poor quality are the city's hallmarks. In Bangkok, ultra-modernity is juxtaposed with tattered urban fabric and extreme poverty. Frequent flooding is an existential hazard. Everything's elevated. A benefit is that walkways slung beneath the rail lines are far more pleasant than the airless sidewalks. And then on to Singapore, where I found most examples of innovation in policy and tall residential architecture. After the other cities, my overwhelming impression was one of spaciousness and greenness and shade. In each of those cities, I met academics and government policymakers, and along the way I visited countless neighbourhoods and buildings and began to build up a picture of the complexity surrounding urban innovation. But my interviews with these architects were my primary method of data collection, and the interviews focused on examining what motivates them to realise non-standard apartment buildings and how their ideas get traction. And this is an important and perhaps overlooked aspect of advancing architecture and the profession of architecture in Australia, and is the focus of my Dunbar report and this webinar. In terms of high-rise apartment building development, form follows financing. In every market, developers of tall buildings focus on views as the selling point, and they try to maximise their profits by creating as much saleable area as possible, of course. The usual way of doing this in an apartment building is by maximising the number of small dwelling units that can be accommodated in a tower and keeping space dedicated to lobbies and corridors to a minimum, usually by clustering apartments around a central core and corridor. Buildings designed this way can't be passively cooled and require very high energy inputs. Dwellings can't be cross-ventilated, and architects oblige with walls of glass that they describe as airy, without a hint of irony when they're unopenable. No matter the social, regulatory, geographic, or environmental conditions of individual cities in Asia or Australia, yield and profit are notoriously difficult to cut through. Yet the architects I interviewed in Southeast Asia have successfully resolved the perennial tensions between developers' yield and social and environmental drivers of building form, and have derived public amenity as well. They're obviously working under the same rules and working with the same developers and working on buildings with the same scope and complexity as the majority of consultants. So what do they do differently? You might think the answer must be that they're fortunate enough to work with courageous and committed clients with a vision. Yes, an essential ingredient, but even these developers have a plan B. My analysis of conversations with architects revealed four main themes. Number one, they're committed to climate responsive place-based architecture, and they steadfastly pursue passive strategies and technical innovation. Deliberate design to induce airflow through dwellings, whether required by planning codes or building regulations or not, was the starting point for utilising passive climatic design principles. Segmentation of physical configurations vertically and horizontally is a key move to obtaining air movement through cross-ventilation and stack ventilation as utilised in the Met. At South Beach Towers in the downtown Singapore Historic District, the South Tower apartments are above a hotel. The lift shaft serving the hotel becomes an airwell in the residential section, enabling all the units to be cross-ventilated. In this way, the units meet or exceed the natural ventilation targets required to achieve Singapore's Green Mark Platinum rating. The building has gardens on intermediate levels and external shading devices on north and south facades, and balconies protect east and west facades. Cross-ventilation also drove sky habitat. Stairwells are located on the outer edge of buildings instead of being buried in an internalised central core. They're daylit and ventilated, more user-friendly, and meet emergency egress requirements as a secondary stair. So generally, these buildings have features like double height balconies for good daylight, outdoor living, and separate utility balconies for domestic uses, balustrades that preserve privacy and permit breezes, and permanent shade hoods over windows and doors, all essential passive design principles for livability in the tropics. The next theme is design theory building. These innovators acknowledge that individual green buildings can only have piecemeal and minimal benefits in the overall urban environment, and they're motivated by making a difference at a far broader level than the individual building project. And they're constantly searching for climate resilient urban scale concepts. Their designs are research-led and their research is design-led. They actively research innovations that involve all spatial scales of infrastructure, and they pursue the practical application of their research outcomes. They also share and disseminate this knowledge widely and by various media, including publications, lectures, and conferences, as well as online. In this way, they ask for input and feedback to continually improve their theory and practice. Ken Yang's work on the bioclimatic skyscraper is well known, and he's deliberately published new research every few years. I have to apologise, but some jackhammering has just commenced in the building that I occupy. Can you hear that, Anna, or is it not too bad?
I actually can't hear it, so I think it's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Moments in
You timed that well.
Unbelievable. Yeah. So we're still on the theme of research theory building. Safdie architects developed a high-rise model that achieved cross-ventilated dwellings with generous outdoor spaces by using the stacking and stepping attributes of the original Montreal Expo 67 housing project habitat that established Mosh Safdie's career. And they re-examined this for contemporary dense Asian cities. Sky Habitat at Bishan was the result of developer CapitaLand seeing Mosh Safdie present the concept at a lecture. Tony Yip was instrumental in Hong Kong's first zero carbon building, ZCB. Yip incorporated concepts learned here into the 30-storey Mok Chui Street apartment building he designed at Kai Tak, including renewable energy and natural ventilation. He was part of a team who developed key measures of thermal transfer and natural ventilation for Hong Kong's Building Environmental Assessment Method Rating System, BAM. WOHA invests extensive design research in urban futuring, and they've developed a deep body of work on rethinking cities for the age of global warming. They conceptualise new urban prototypes in which individual buildings are merely components within a self-sufficient city system that are steps in incremental change. For example, Skyville at Dawson is a housing development board project, which is a series of 47-storey interlinked towers. 3 groups of 4 towers are arranged in a diamond-shaped plan. So it makes 12 towers altogether. In a building with 960 apartments, residents can walk the total 150-metre length of this megastructure at various heights in the building by walking through the community spaces and garden platforms if they wish. In a future city, the pattern could be extended indefinitely with joined-up city rooftops to utilise that space better for food production and more effective catchment of climate resources, including solar energy, daylight, rain and breeze. Solar capital, if you will. WOHA has also developed indices to evaluate the social and ecological performance of buildings and precincts they design. Indicators like civic generosity and ecosystem contribution. These reward the things that matter. The indices use measures that are equally accessible to the community, planners and developers, and they sit in counterpoint to metrics like the net to gross measure of yield that favours only one functional group, the developer and their financiers. WOHA evaluate their own projects this way and invite others to do the same. Tan Cheng Seong's professional career has spanned Singapore's transformation from impoverished post-World War II housing shortages to a first world nation where people have decent housing they own. At the time I met him, Tan continued to lead ARC urban architects and planners in exploring future urbanism and future urban challenges, including addressing underutilisation of land and underutilisation of human potential. He stresses that urban living is not yet understood. Pre-pandemic, he warns that major unforeseen social upheavals are yet to come in urbanising societies globally, and is extremely concerned about the majority of urban populations who will have very little to do in future cities. In his design research, he's investigating the second and third wave of high-density urban living and has held a number of public exhibitions proposing new typologies and paradigms for the city of the future with his Skyland concept and exploring the impacts of virtual reality and societal and demographic change in high-rise cities like Singapore. The third theme. Asked how their innovations got traction with clients, some interviewees revealed a spectrum of responses that ranged from they saw value in it to they had a vision and were very passionate to people come to us because we do super green buildings. They just want to have a super green building like the ones we do. Nevertheless, the desire to produce climate responsive, sustainable apartments was rarely the developer's primary project driver. For them, yield, a focus on the views available from the proposed apartments, panoramic or otherwise, and raising the property value were almost always the key drivers. Yet their own rules were allowed to be changed for the right reasons. They were willing to experiment with new ideas on live projects if there were clear benefits to the purchasers and they could see commercial value in them. If not, they were willing to go back to Plan B, a standard international style, energy-intensive design with another consultant. The architects I interviewed are committed to understanding the client's pragmatic objectives, and they match ideas about the future and sustainable design innovations to those business needs. For example, when One Mill Main Rise was developed in 2000, bay windows, planters, and air conditioning ledges were encouraged and weren't included in GFA calculations in Singapore. In practice, bay windows offered little usable floor area for residents, but helped the developer's bottom line tremendously. To ensure the end user benefited from elements that developers were incentivised to add, WOHA designed the bay windows as monsoon windows, with an opening in the horizontal surface of the bay, allowing fresh air to the apartment even during heavy monsoon rains. The developer saw value in this as a tangible innovation that they could show to buyers who valued natural ventilation and who could interact with the windows to moderate their environment. And the air conditioning ledges were developed as full sunshades and rain overhangs. Some developers valued architectural design as a strategy to differentiate their product from the market and were searching for an alternative to the glass towers and extrusions you see all over Asia. For example, the distinctive stepping form of sky habitat not only provided an overt visual statement, it met the client's extremely focused brief and capitalised on Singapore government's planning incentives and building policies at the time of promoting livable outdoor space. And this brings me to the fourth theme. Innovators have thorough knowledge of the regulatory environment and they use this to innovate rather than fall back on deemed to satisfy or acceptable solutions, which are both limiting and not mandatory. Brought onto the project after DA, MAKE used the Hong Kong regulations and lateral thinking to achieve their design objectives in Luna. The space is so tightly controlled in Hong Kong, there is seemingly no room for architectural innovation. There's certainly no room for external shading. It's not required by regulation, and if proposed, must be an integrated part of the external cladding, the depth of which is seriously restricted to 150 mils by site-specific GFA rules. The ubiquitous Hong Kong bay windows are outlawed now as well. So a multifunctional design approach by MAKE provided wall shading, balconies, and more amenity for residents. Architects are also highly supportive of regulatory incentive schemes that match desirable architectural attributes. They recognise that the right kind of regulations can deliver positive change to the typology of high-density apartment buildings and may even achieve transformative change for cities. They see certain incentives as opportunities to move a developer toward an architectural innovation that will benefit the city, and they engage proactively with regulations and incentives to improve them. For example, there was initial resistance to Singapore's Skyrise Greenery initiative. It was aimed at encouraging building owners to upgrade their rooftops by providing a subsidy up to half the cost for installing green roofs and green walls. Newton Suites took up the subsidy and became instrumental in demonstrating the possibilities of integrating vegetation to at least equal the site area, and achieved 100% green plot ratio in this groundbreaking building. The Skyrise Greenery seed funding in Singapore was phenomenally successful and had the desired effect of typological transformation to greening, and supported the development of green roof technical know-how in the construction industry in Singapore. So I've just explained these 4 ways that architectural innovators get traction. But are these enough to change the paradigm? Southeast Asian cities are locked into a vicious cycle where people can barely afford to occupy any space, and where the urban heat island effect seems beyond building scale control. Acute pressures to maximise land use are placing acute pressures on people. Asian cities are suffering tremendously because of the competition for space. The cost of land represents approximately 70% of development costs. Intense development is producing economically and socially uneven societies and ecologically unhealthy environments. Dense urbanisation has reduced air movement in the humid cities and had a marked effect on overnight minimum temperatures over the past 60 years. Hong Kong recorded 41 nights over 28 degrees in 2017, up from 0 in 1957. Heat and humidity may even get worse in the next 10 years or so as the effects of global warming intensify. The particular problem of millions of split system air conditioners pumping out heated air directly contributes to the heat island effect. Not everyone has access to air conditioning for cooling in the overheated tropical urban environment. This poses as many health problems for them as having to rely on air conditioning continuously does for others. In addition, many have no access to sunlight or ventilation, let alone views. Pan-Cheng Seong's assessment is that Asia is experiencing something that the West has never had to understand. We suddenly became so dense, so rich, so wasteful. His assessment's quite confronting. He says, this is urban density where no one cares. It's broken. I would like to use the word broken. At this point, you might be thinking, well, that's Asia. This is Australia. Things are completely different here. But are they? Australia's population is forecast to reach 36 million people by 2050, with with our largest cities' populations becoming comparable to the current Hong Kong and Bangkok? What kind of transformed cities will we inhabit by then? Reflecting on this, I canvassed the interviewees' views on future directions for next generation apartment buildings in Asia and Australia. And here 3 concepts stand out. Firstly, high-density housing is integral to the sustainable city of the near future, but the issues are much broader than the typology alone. If you don't have a great built environment, you are that much poorer, environmentally, socially, and environmentally. Interviewees support a strong sustainability agenda with formal regulatory processes. Mandatory requirements and incentives to eliminate carbon emissions are needed urgently to meet Paris Climate Agreement benchmarks. To date, voluntary rating systems have barely made a dent in emissions worldwide compared to the task required to transform new and existing buildings to zero carbon. The regulatory strategy must be integrated and consistent across planning, building, and economic development policies and actions, with clear regulations, with clear compliance targets and verification methods that everyone can understand. As an example, Singapore has a whole of government approach to planning, building, and ESD. The Urban Renewal Authority is prescriptive about how they frame their planning guidelines, and they've worked cooperatively with all other relevant agencies, the Building Construction Authority, Housing Development Board, and so on, to get the desired results. Incentives like bonus GFA promote planning objectives and are clearly linked to green building policy. Published formulae ensure transparency in the way that GFA incentives are awarded. Everyone knows what to expect. But the system doesn't always go according to plan, but authorities monitor results and are quick to modify or close down initiatives that are anti-productive. For example, a balcony bonus that was meant to promote tropical living led to outsized balconies and minute apartments in private developments and was quickly withdrawn. Another pitfall is that large and conservative developers dominate the system, and eligibility criteria for concessions and subsidies often exclude smaller developers and innovators. Singapore has quite successfully greened its environment and to some extent is addressing green building innovations, but its transition away from fossil fuels is agonisingly slow. So at the time of reporting on my research, it was a long way from achieving its target of 80% of all buildings certified Green Mark Platinum by 2030. So the low-hanging fruit like energy-efficient lighting, water-cooled air conditioning, and the green plot ratio are doing all the heavy lifting. Ken Yang pointed out that the wide discrepancy between nature and what the existing built environment is, how it performs, what it uses as energy and materials is the cause of environmental devastation and impairment. Another common theme that arose was the need to think outside the building. For example, high levels of urban noise and dust compel residents to keep their windows closed to avoid unwanted pollution, and they prompt regulations about acoustic glazing in buildings. The architects I interviewed take an optimistic, design-centred approach with the view that there's much scope for potential synergies between urban strategies, climate-responsive building level strategies, and new technology that will allow us to open the windows. To achieve this, we must shift the emphasis from the need for the building to do everything. Citizen participation in visioning and greater custodianship of the urban environment could lead to game-changing mandatory regulations on reducing urban noise and accountability. Waste management systems and private transportation reform that mean fewer cars on the road could lead to less noise and dust, more natural ventilation, lower energy buildings, and more space for renewable energy systems, and more capacity for dense cities to be able to regenerate their natural systems. The third game changer is three-dimensional planning and shrinking the city's eco-footprint. The architects I interviewed suggested that current two-dimensional land use spatial planning methods need to be transformed to three-dimensional city and urban planning that makes the most of the solar capital available to a city to achieve the twin goals of reducing energy demand and producing renewable energy. This model shows Punggol in Singapore with the green roof terraces of the waterway buildings there in the centre. My respondents say we seriously need to do something more with roofs. We need to find ways to create wide, flat roofs for more effective catchment areas for solar energy and water. Making provision for connected roofscapes could make space for urban farming, create biodiverse habitat, and begin to reduce cities' eco-footprint. So what can we do better here in Australia as architects to ensure the next generation of our apartment buildings will make better homes and be more acceptable to wider community concerns like being more affordable and consuming less energy, producing considerably fewer greenhouse gas emissions and being able to adapt to a decarbonised economy and be part of livable, healthy communities? To quote Chen Xiong again, it's a very complex situation which is really beyond infrastructure, beyond the built frame. What are all these boxes for, he says? What is all this fantastic architecture for? Architecture is going to be totally different. We can't simply overlay Asian designs and policies onto the Australian political, economic, social and governance context, but we can flip the paradigm by heeding the Asian megacity experience to rethink our approach to apartment buildings in Australia. If we take action now before thousands more individual tall towers are built within metres of each other on small sites in our cities, but not cooperating with each other in any way, we may still have the luxury of pursuing a place-based, climate-sensitive approach to urban density in Australia. If we really want to make city living good and possible, we have to rethink it totally. Contemporary high-density residential architecture in Australia is mostly free of critical design examination, and the developer model is accepted. And there's an entrenched belief in the urban development and planning system that developer-led ratios like net to gross, about yield, are intrinsically good, rather than being a measure of how mean or unsustainable building actually is. Yield and profit has led to a fixation with compact floor plans that fail to provide long-term livability. Instead, we need to reward the things that matter, like civic generosity and a development's capacity to provide its own energy, food and water. High-density buildings that generate all the energy they need on site are not likely to be tall, standalone towers. Taller and larger may not be the answer. Why build apartment buildings that rely on last century technology? Why accept that our future is either low-rise landed development on city fringes or taller and taller towers? In order to advocate change, we need to be clear on what's needed. Ken Yang said, "We architects are not very powerful or influential, but we can lead by example." So what does he mean by that? Whether we play a central role in procurement or not, architects are the three-dimensional thinkers with the skills to question the status quo and help the community visualise positive change, rather than being continually dismayed at the type of urban environment which results from speculative development. My conclusions from the Dunbar study are: 1, architects have a responsibility to do better rather than settling for standard acceptable solutions to justify lack of innovation. Performance-based planning and building regs are ready-made vehicles that we have yet to fully utilise. Architects must be more engaged and lead more critical discussion in the broader community regarding design understanding and expectations, in counterpoint to image-driven design reviews which are presented via social media. The general public and other property professionals need our assistance in developing objective judgment and clear focus on the rationale of fundamental passive climatic design principles, how they're embodied in buildings, and how they benefit occupants and the wider community, along with developers themselves. In order to advocate and support effective regulation based on sound policy, architects need to be critically engaged in shaping the sustainability agenda by doing the design research and thinking outside the building as custodians of the external environment. It just isn't good enough to focus on the building as an object in space, unconnected to the urban social system it's situated within. We're professional integrators, and we can and must play a more strategic role in urban reform by collaborating with our counterparts in the development industry to be accountable for what we design and innovate on win-win ways to transform high-density living in cities. And we need to be authentic. Here in Queensland, we pay a lot of lip service to climate responsive design, but in practice, it seems to lack the clout to gain traction in mainstream tall apartment building developments. In conclusion, and I'll just go back to what architects can do, the aim of my fellowship was to illuminate what goes into the making of world-class apartment buildings in order to capture the attention of the Australian housing development industry and regulators at different levels of government. My main hope for this study was that it would lead to a positive contribution toward strategies, architectural business and policy that can influence the emergence of potent next generation climate-based apartment building architecture in Australia for both private and public benefit. I'm convinced that there is a better way to develop livable, sustainable, affordable apartment dwellings and deliver change for better to the Australian urban living. But the biggest assumption I'm making is that the conditions that nurture and support innovation are present in Australia. In conclusion, 2030 is fast approaching, and that 43% greenhouse gas emissions reduction target that our current government is now talking about is barely budging. When I originally presented the Dunbar lecture in May in 2019, the UK had gone a whole week without using coal-fired power for the first time since the 19th century. And that was probably the last time, as energy policy faltered ever since. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Dunbar Bequest and the Australian Institute of Architects for the opportunity to carry out this research. There were a large number of people who helped me establish contacts, and all the architects who agreed to be interviewed for my study. And you can find my full report on the links that the Institute has provided.
First of all, thanking Rosie for the presentation today, but also thanking Rosie for taking the time to be on the selection panel for this year. So we have published the list of panelists that will be on the panel for the selection of the 2023 fellowship, on which we have Callum Senjov, who is a representative for Imagine. He's the current co-chair for Imagine. Britt Anderson, who was a good friend of Jennifer. Mark Jones, who obviously is the immediate past president. Rosie, and then Jim, who is Rosie's partner in life. And the No,
Jennifer.
did I get that wrong?
Jennifer's partner.
Jennifer's part. I don't know what I'm saying. Jennifer's partner, of course. So he's currently the custodian of the fellowship as well, and then Amy Deeganhart, who's the current president. And I can tell you that these guys were practically fighting over the roles of the jury or the selection panel. So that's really lovely. They're really looking forward to seeing the submissions come through. So with that, thank you very much, Rosie, and thank you everyone who joined. And we're looking forward to some more nominations for that selection panel to read through. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out to the chapter staff.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.